All right, let's get the show on the road, as they say. Hello, everyone. This is Dwight Woods, the Jeet Kune Rebel, and welcome to the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast number 51. And this is the one about UFC fighters or champions and Jeet Kune. As you guys are logging in, hey Hector, Hector, I recognize your name. I'm actually gonna call your name in a few minutes. Very good to see you. If you guys would, as you log in, like I tell you all the time, I know where you're from, a lot of you, but if you would just say where you're logging in from and hit the like button, and if I say anything smart or insightful, feel free to continue to hit the like button. Amir is telling me he's got that shirt, so let me do it in early, because yeah, this was gosh, I don't know how long ago I got this one. All right, so I recognize a lot of the names here. Audi Barger is here. Scott O'Keefe is here. So Hector's from Massachusetts. Good one. All right, so let's do this as they say, right? Hey Henry, all right, and there's Angela from Barbados. She always gives us a little shout out every once in a while. All right, so origin story, right? So you guys know that I volunteer answers over on Quora from time to time. So the question that I fielded was, have there been any UFC champions who studied Jeet Kune? So before I give you my answer, right, let me tell you what this other guy on Quora said, right? His answer was no, none, zilch, nada. And then he goes on to say, this may have something to do with Bruce Lee, the founder of Jeet Kune, being an actor and not a real fighter. Right? So obviously what we have here is, another person with the idea that since there's not like a UFC-like fight record, wins and losses and draws and what have you, since there's no fight record for Bruce Lee, then Bruce Lee himself and his art of Jeet Kune are to be disregarded and discounted in the world of martial art, right? Realistic martial art, and even in the world of martial combat sports, right? Which it continues to flabbergast me, right? And I'm sure it flabbergasts you guys too. But anyhow, so here was my answer, right? Let me read this for you. So I said, let me try to clear this up for you. Jeet Kune is not a sport. It is a self-defense oriented martial art and martial philosophy. So you wouldn't study Jeet Kune for UFC participation. That being said, there are aspects to JKD training, namely Junfan kickboxing and Junfan grappling, that have specific application to the MMA type or UFC fighting. There are a few UFC coaches who have trained in JKD and have used its principles in training their own students. Sean Shirk by Greg Nelson, Brock Lesnar by Eric Paulson, Chris Weidman by Ray Longo. And then I put in parentheses that I did that from memory, right? Even the thing about saying namely Junfan kickboxing and Junfan grappling, sometimes when I answer these questions, it's not like I sit down and research them, for like 20 minutes and then give an answer. I'm on the computer, the question comes in, I answer and move on. Right? And then I mentioned that Anderson Silva himself had spent some time with Dan Inosanto, and then I gave a shout out to Jesse James Kowakowski. I always get that name wrong, Kosakowski, right? Who's up and coming at Bellator, right? Trained by his dad, Ron. So I posted it, right, on my page. So I got to tell you something. Don't tell anybody I told you this. I spend obviously a lot of time on Facebook, doing the 2 shows every week and what have you. But I really don't know much about how Facebook works. So I posted it on my page, and as far as I was concerned, that would be it. Maybe a couple of people would see it, and that'd be the end of it. Boy, was I wrong, right? So I went back later that day, and there had been a ton of reaction. So, so this one I'm embarrassed of, because the guy's Facebook handle is in what I believe are Greek letters, and so I don't know what his name is, right? And I'm very sorry about that. I should be able to say his name on camera. But his was, I think, probably the first comment, and he mentioned that John Jones had trained with Kevin Seaman, which was something that I was not aware of. David Cheng from South Bay Jeet Kune, he asked if it counts that Conor McGregor trained at Straight Blast in Ireland, and with John Cav, and then Paul factored in, right, and mentioned that McGregor talks about how much of an idol of Bruce Lee is for him, and Paul says that when Conor McGregor is not talking, you know, to hype up his fights and what have you, that he talks about training, the philosophy of the JKD influence becomes very apparent, right? And then Burton Richardson, which who most of you guys will know, Burt writes that many UFC coaches have a strong JKD background, which accounts for the success of their fighters. And then he mentioned some of the people I mentioned: Greg Nelson, Ray Longo, Greg Jackson, Eric Paulson, Mark DeLagrotti, Matt Thornton, John Kavanaugh, Robert Folies, and on and on. And then Burt says that when he trained Chris Lieben, the base approach that he used was Jeet Kune philosophy, and that helped to transform Lieben's performance up to the level of title contention, right? So, and then he embellished on that for Paul, that one of the things that they would do in training Chris Lieben was, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correct, it was knife sparring, right, to help with footwork and quickness. And so then Elias Salemi, Lester Griffin, and Mark Tucker, they all chimed in. Elias talked about Tim Bosch. I think I might have that name wrong also. Lester talked about Frank Mir, and Mark Tucker talked about James Wilkes and Josh Barnett, right? And then Hector, who is watching, Hector chimed in a little bit later with Pat Gorilla Ninja Casey, right? Who is 4-0 and will be fighting for Bellator. And he's been doing JKD for the past couple of years with Hector up in Massachusetts. And then he also mentioned Miguel Cuevas, right? Who's another guy that Hector is training. So, and then Guy Chase, another of my JKD seniors that you guys would be familiar with, if you've ever watched the Jeet Kune dialogues, right? Guy Chase mentioned Marcus Davis, Sean Gannon, Patrick Court, and Rob Font, to name a few. So then David Chang came back in, and David said, okay, given the strong JKD connection to MMA fighters, why doesn't JKD have a better reputation in the MMA community, right? So that's where it started all over again. So Burt Richardson says, great question, David. And he says it's because, in his experience, most JKD people have limited their physical expression to Bruce Lee's 1973 version, and therefore they're not able to handle the clinch or the wrestling or the jiu-jitsu aspects of MMA. And then few JKD practitioners do the unlimited sparring that is the litmus test in MMA, which is kind of interesting because the unlimited sparring, I think, used to be and should still be the litmus test in JKD training also, right? So David continued, wouldn't someone who trains in the pre-73 version of JKD still greatly benefit in their stand-up game? And Burt says yes, of course, if they know how to apply it in sparring, right? So then he tells a little story about Chris Lieben, who wasn't convinced that the Hyun Sao and hit him back would work, but once he applied it on him in sparring, then Chris became a convert, let's call it, right? Which is the thing that Burt stresses, that with the MMA people, you have to be able to pull it off in sparring in order for them to be convinced of anything, right? And Bert says he thinks that's what Bruce Lee was all about, which is proof through sparring, right? And then Greg Nelson showed up, right? And Greg said, how I teach MMA is really no different. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. Greg says that he doesn't teach in a cookie cutter manner because each fighter has a unique background, unique strengths, unique weaknesses. And so he consistently uses Junfan kickboxing, trapping on the ground, elements of Panantukan, Muay Thai, Savate, boxing, wrestling, Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, right? The strategies, the tactics, the techniques, the tools, and the training methods from many arts, right? And Bert says, well, that's the JKD philosophy, right? And then he quotes Cedar Bruce from Way of the Dragon. If it doesn't matter where it comes from, if it can help you in a fight, then you should use it. So a little bit later, Greg must have gotten really inspired. One day I have to ask him, and then I have to ask him if he was taking a page out of the Rebels book, because what he did was, he says, when training, especially sparring, what do you do that you do not do in MMA? And he says sparring was the crucible of Jeet Kune to see what would hold up under pressure. So they use gloves, they use the headgear, and while training for MMA, we spar using all the boxing techniques, the straight blast, trapping when applicable, especially on the ground or up against the cage, kicking from head to toe. You use the knees, you use elbow pads, and you clinch, you sweep, trip, tackle, throw. You spar with the small gloves, you spar with the 16-ounce boxing gloves. I mean, all of which was going on similarly in the 1970s, you know, at the Chinatown School and in Sifu Dan's backyard gym, and then at the Kali Academy, right? So Greg says, we mimic a full-out fight against already trained and prepared fighters with varied and different levels, skills, and abilities. If you guys listen to what Tanya Subing Monroe talked about her experiences at the Kali Academy in the 1970s, it's this from that era. The same thing, I should say. This same thing that Greg Nelson is talking about in 2018. This degree of experimentation, this degree of realistic, approximating the reality of the situation. This is what was going on in JKD in the 1970s, right? So, and here's where I said, I'm wondering if Greg was taking a page out of my book, because he writes, on page 44 of the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, right? It says, to become a champion requires condition of readiness that causes the individual to approach with pleasure even the most tedious of practice sessions. He says on page 46, it says, most beginning athletes are unwilling to drive themselves hard enough. And then it just says on and on and on from Cedar Bruce Lee about athletics and sports performance, right? Then he says that, in fact, in pages 43 to 69, this is why I'm convinced he was copying what I do with you guys. I'm kidding. He says in the chapter on qualities, the words athlete, sports, performance, and champion appear at least 50 times, right? So, and he says that he fully understands the differences between a street fight and ring or cage, but that he's had far, far more fights on tar, tile, cement than on canvas. And he's used far, far more boxing, wrestling, and Muay Thai than any of the other arts that he's studied over 4 decades, right? And he concludes by saying it's all part of the process, right? And then he leaves us with Bruce Lee quote, self-knowledge is the basis of Jeet Kune Do because it is effective not only for the individual's martial art, but also for his life as a human being. So if I may attempt to speak for Greg and maybe also for Siheng Bert, I believe part of what they're saying is, as guys who have been involved in athletic competition for decades, right? Bert in baseball, and then Greg in gymnastics and wrestling. I think one of the values they're saying of training for competition is how much you learn about yourself and about your art and what works and what doesn't work, you know, in the art and for you, and that is what JKD is all about. Like I said earlier, the reality of the situation. So as I forget who it was that first clued me into this, but it's something that Sifu Inasano says, that you want to be informed by the combat sports, not that you necessarily want to engage in them, but you do want to be informed by their training method. So my conclusion, I should have started with this so you guys could spend fewer minutes, right? It goes back to something that was said in Chris Kent and Tim Tackett's book from the 80s, page 10, Jeet Kune Kickboxing, where it says, that is why JKD has remained so long a mystery to so many people. It is one art, but it expresses itself in many languages, right? So if you get what everyone that I just reported on was saying, it's that the principles or the concepts which govern the Jeet Kune methodology, these things are being used in MMA training. And sometimes you can recognize them, like the photographs that Bert put and that I reused them in the ad for this broadcast, right? So you have a lot of people doing the straight leg obstruction, you know, the lead leg side kick, all these things. Sometimes you recognize the JKD methodology visually because of a technique, but at other times, and maybe even more often, the Jeet Kune influence is kind of surreptitious, you know, it's kind of hidden, or because you can't really see a principle now, can you? Right? Anyhow, so and ultimately reminds me of, we'll finish with this, a Bruce Lee quote that says, a Jeet Kune man who says that Jeet Kune is exclusively Jeet Kune is simply not with it. He is still hung up on his own and on his self-closing resistance. So I think that in the JKD world, you know, we have to be careful that we're not trying to drive this wedge between the Bruce Lee's art and MMA because there is a relationship, you know, beyond any doubt. It's almost as if I had this thought, maybe it's time for another Jeet Kune book entitled Absorb What Is Useful, Volume 2, right? Anyhow, okay, that's it. So for today, feel free, share, like, comment, ask questions. I will go through everything after posting. Sign up for notifications for when we go live on Facebook, and sign up also for when I post the videos on the new YouTube channels, both for the broadcast and for the Jeet Kune dialogues. And keep an eye out for the new website, including the online store. I Love Jeet Kune. You can still get the Quick Skills Series, Volume 1. And don't go too far. In about 40 minutes or so, I'll be back for a special Wednesday edition of the Jeet Kune Dialogues with Stefan Kesting of Grapple Arts. And probably later today or even by tomorrow, I should have Friday's guest confirmed for episode 34 of the Jeet Kune Dialogue. So just check in later for that. So that's it. Come back at 4 o'clock if you can. Hang out with Stefan Kesting and me, and then we'll go from there. And I'll see you guys back here next week, next Wednesday, same time, 3 p.m. for another edition of the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast. You guys take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. See ya.